Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. The arrival of Russian military jets in Venezuela is more than a headline. It is a signpost of a shifting world order. It has sent shockwaves through Washington, revived the shadows of the Cold War, and raised urgent questions about the future of global power. To understand why this is happening, we must look past the spectacle of military posturing and the simplistic narratives of good versus evil. We must ask the most critical question: what economic interests are truly at stake? The United States government frames its hostility toward Venezuela as a noble defense of democracy. But if we scrape away the rhetoric, we find a much older and deeper story: the struggle over oil and spheres of influence. Venezuela is not just another nation. It sits atop the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. For decades, U.S. corporations reaped enormous profits from this oil under governments friendly to Washington. However, when leaders like Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro insisted that this wealth be used to fund social programs, education, and housing for the Venezuelan people, they were suddenly branded as dictators. The language of human rights became a convenient mask for what is, in essence, an economic conflict over who controls a vital resource. Now enter Russia. The landing of its jets in Caracas is not merely military theater. It is a calculated message to Washington: you are not the only superpower with global influence. By planting its flag in America's so-called backyard, Moscow asserts that it too can play the game of empire. This move is strategic. Facing pressure from NATO expansion and Western sanctions, Russia gains crucial leverage. The logic is simple. If the United States can operate near Russia's borders, then Russia can do the same in Latin America. This is a chess move in a much larger game, one that spans from Ukraine to global energy markets. And here is the hook that should grab your attention. When empires collide, it is not the presidents or the generals who pay the price. It is the ordinary people, the workers, the families, the citizens who suffer the consequences. In Venezuela, crushing U.S. sanctions have crippled the economy, leading to food and medicine shortages. In Russia, citizens endure the weight of economic isolation. And in the United States, trillions of dollars are funneled into military budgets while schools crumble and healthcare remains out of reach for millions. The mainstream media sells us an entertaining narrative of a Putin versus Trump showdown, but this is dangerously misleading. It reduces complex class struggles and geopolitical rivalries to a spectacle of personalities obscuring the real engine of these conflicts: capitalism's endless competition for markets, resources, and dominance. This escalation is a dangerous game. What begins as a symbolic show of strength, the landing of a few jets, can quickly spiral into a direct confrontation if either side miscalculates. The presence of Russian assets in Venezuela creates a volatile cycle. Washington sees it as a provocation, Caracas sees it as survival, and Moscow uses it as a bargaining chip. The risk grows exponentially, and the fragile peace we take for granted begins to crack. But let us be even clearer. The core of this tension is oil. Control over who drills, refines, and sells this resource translates directly into global power. When Venezuela dared to assert its sovereignty over its own oil, it crossed a red line. The campaign of sanctions and isolation was not born from a sudden concern for democratic principles, but from a concrete interest in reclaiming control over that wealth. Russia, itself an energy giant, sees in Venezuela both a strategic ally and an opportunity to weaken U.S. dominance in global energy markets. Lost in the drama of world leaders is the human dimension. For the average Venezuelan family, this geopolitical struggle is not about diplomacy. It is about empty shelves, skyrocketing prices, and hospitals without supplies. They are told their suffering is a necessary sacrifice for democracy, while the real battle is over the oil beneath their feet. In Russia, families face rising inflation and limited opportunities as their government projects strength abroad. And in the United States, working people watch as their tax dollars fund military deployments instead of rebuilding their own communities. This is the hidden cost of great power politics. The jets, the sanctions, the speeches, they are only the surface. Beneath them lies a system that prioritizes power and profit over human need. The true tragedy unfolds in the quiet suffering of millions who are never consulted, yet always impacted. So, let us be unequivocal. The rising tensions between the U.S. and Venezuela, sharpened by Russian involvement, are not about democracy versus dictatorship. They are about power, profits, and control. Until we recognize this, we will remain trapped in a cycle where working people bear the burden of conflicts they did not choose. If we want peace, stability, and true democracy, the solution will not come from military posturing or foreign interventions. It will come only when ordinary people in Venezuela, in Russia, and in the United States demand economic systems that prioritize human needs over corporate profits and geopolitical game. Because this confrontation is not an isolated incident. It is the latest chapter in a long and brutal history where the resources of the global South become the chessboard for the rivalries of the global North. For centuries, powerful nations have treated Latin America, Africa, and Asia as their own private preserves, extracting wealth and installing compliant governments, all while preaching civilization and progress. The pattern is relentless. A country rich in resources attempts to use them for its own people, and in response, it is met with economic sabotage, covert intervention, or outright invasion. We see this pattern clearly in Venezuela. The same script was written for Iran, for Cuba, for the Congo, and for countless others. The names change, the justifications are updated, but the underlying motive remains the same: control. The arrival of Russian jets, then, is not the start of a new conflict, but an escalation of a very old one. It is the moment a former colonial power, Russia, sees an opportunity to challenge the current dominant power, the United States, on its own turf, using the same playbook of economic and military influence. This is where the narrative of a new Cold War becomes so seductive and so inadequate. The original Cold War was framed as an ideological battle between communism and capitalism. Today, the battle is between different flavors of capitalism, state-centered versus corporate-dominated, but the goal is identical: geopolitical and economic supremacy. Russia is not promoting an alternative socialist vision for Venezuela. It is making a strategic investment. It is securing a foothold, gaining access to resources, and creating a headache for its primary rival. The Venezuelan government, in turn, is not aligning with an ideological soulmate. It is seeking a powerful patron to ensure its own survival against immense external pressure. And so the people of Venezuela are caught in a perfect storm. They are squeezed between the failures and corruption of their own domestic leadership and the brutal external pressure of a superpower determined to bend them to its will. The sanctions, which the U.S. claims are targeted, have in effect become a collective punishment, a weapon of economic warfare that devastates the most vulnerable. When you block a country's ability to sell its main export, when you cut it off from the global financial system, you are not sanctioning a government, you are sanctioning an entire population. This is the grim reality of modern empire. The boots on the ground have often been replaced by lines of code in a financial database. The blockade is no longer just naval, it is digital, financial, and diplomatic. But the effect is the same: scarcity, desperation, and the slow erosion of a society's ability to care for its people. The ultimate irony, the profound tragedy, is that the very resource that could provide prosperity, the vast pools of oil beneath Venezuela, has become a curse. It is the prize that attracts the attention of empires and the lever used to break the will of a nation. This is the resource curse on a geopolitical scale, where natural wealth invites not development, but domination. So what is the way out? The answer will not be found in choosing a side between Washington or Moscow, or in believing that one empire is more benevolent than the other. The solution begins with a fundamental rejection of the entire framework of imperial domination. It begins with solidarity among ordinary people across these artificial battle lines. The path forward demands that we recognize our common interest. The worker in a Caracas slum, the farmer in the Russian countryside, and the factory worker in the American Midwest are not enemies. They are all in different ways victims of a system that sacrifices their well-being at the altar of power and profit. Their real adversaries are not each other, but the structures that pit them against one another. True change will come when we stop accepting the stories we are sold, the stories about noble missions and evil dictators, and start asking, who benefits? It will come when we demand that our resources be used to build, not to destroy, when we insist that our governments prioritize human dignity over geopolitical scorekeeping. The Russian jets in Venezuela are a symptom of a sick global system. We can focus on the symptom, or we can dare to address the disease. The choice is ours. Do we continue to be pawns in their game, or do we finally change the rules? He pauses, letting the silence hang in the room, his gaze sweeping across the audience. He leans forward, his voice dropping to a more intimate yet insistent tone. So where does that leave us? It leaves us at a crossroads of comprehension. We've identified the illness, a global system poisoned by the relentless pursuit of resource control and geopolitical dominance. We've diagnosed the symptoms, the sanctions that strangle, the proxy conflicts that destabilize, the human suffering that is dismissed as collateral damage. But a diagnosis is useless without a prescription for a cure. And the cure will not be found in a new sanction, a new military deployment, or a new round of aggressive rhetoric from any capital. These are just larger doses of the same poison that made us sick in the first place. The solution is not to rearrange the pieces on the imperial board, but to overturn the board itself